Step into the velvet darkness of a story well told, where the shadows are deep and the emotions are even deeper. We bring you the smooth, cinematic narratives that explore the quiet and beautiful mysteries of the soul. Subscribe today and lose yourself in our world of deep shadows.
The night my son told me he was getting married, I poured 2 glasses of bourbon and set one on the counter for him. He didn't touch his. He just stood there in my kitchen, grinning like he'd won something, and maybe he thought he had. His name is Daniel. He's 34 years old, and he has my late wife's eyes and my stubborn jaw, and for most of his life I considered him the smartest decision I ever had a hand in making. He graduated top of his class at Penn State. He built a career in commercial real estate that I was genuinely proud of. He called me every Sunday morning without fail, even when he was busy, even when I told him he didn't have to. So when he set his phone on the counter and slid it toward me, a photo of him and a woman I'd never met, arms around each other on what looked like a beach in the Carolinas, I smiled. I picked up the phone, I looked at her face, and something in my chest went very, very quiet. Her name was Vanessa. She was 31 years old. She had dark hair, a wide smile, and the kind of confidence in front of a camera that either comes from a very happy childhood or a great deal of practice. Daniel told me they'd been together 8 months. He told me she worked in marketing. He told me she was the one. I told him I was happy for him. I poured my bourbon down the sink after he left. I want to be clear about something. I am not the kind of father who interferes. I raised Daniel to make his own choices and stand behind them. After his mother died 11 years ago now, pancreatic cancer, 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end, I made a decision that I would not become the kind of man who holds on too tight because he's afraid of losing again. I gave Daniel room. I gave him space. I trusted him. But I also spent 31 years in insurance investigation before I retired. And there are certain things you cannot unknow once you know them. The first time I met Vanessa in person was at a dinner Daniel arranged at a restaurant downtown. She arrived 7 minutes after we did, which I noticed. And she apologized with the practiced warmth of someone who apologizes often and means it less each time. She ordered the most expensive thing on the menu without looking at the price, which is either confidence or habit. She called Daniel babe 14 times in 2 hours. I counted. She was charming. I want to be fair about that. She was genuinely funny, and she asked me real questions about my life, and she looked at Daniel with something that could have been love. People who are very good at this are often genuinely warm. That's what makes them effective. What made me pay attention was a smaller thing. Midway through dinner, Daniel's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it and said something about a property deal he'd been working on, a commercial lot he was close to closing. His biggest commission yet. He mentioned a number. Not a small number. Vanessa's hand found his under the table. She smiled at him. And then her eyes, just briefly, just for a half-second, moved to me. Not to his face. Not to his phone. To me. I've interviewed thousands of people across 3 decades. Claimants, witnesses, defendants, fraud artists of every variety. I know what it looks like when someone is calculating, when they are not reacting to the moment but processing information and filing it away. I drove home that night and I sat in the driveway for a long time. I told myself I was being unfair. That I was a 63-year-old widower who'd spent his career assuming the worst about people, and maybe that had followed me home. That Daniel was happy. That happiness was enough. I went inside. I made coffee. I opened my laptop, and I started looking. What I found in the first 48 hours was nothing alarming on its face. Vanessa had a LinkedIn profile marketing consultant, a string of short-term positions, nothing longer than 18 months. A Facebook account that went back 7 years but had a strange gap between year 2 and year 4, where almost nothing was posted. An Instagram with just over 800 followers. All photos of food and sunsets and Daniel, nothing before 2 years ago. The gap bothered me. I called a man named Roy Ketterman. Roy and I worked together for almost a decade before he left to run his own private investigation firm in Philadelphia. I told him what I had. I told him about the dinner. I told him about the look. He was quiet for a moment. "You want me to run her?" he asked. "I want you to find the gap," I said. He called me back in 4 days. The name Vanessa had been using her last name had been legally changed 6 years ago. Before that, she had a different last name, a different city, and a civil judgment against her in the amount of $42,000. The judgment had been filed by a man in his late 50s. The nature of the claim: fraud and conversion. She had been his fiancée. The engagement had lasted 11 months. When it ended, so had a significant portion of his savings account transferred in small amounts over time, each one with a plausible explanation. The case had settled out of court. She'd paid back less than a third. I sat with that information for a long time. I want you to understand what it feels like to hold something like that. On one side of the scale, you have facts documented, sourced, real. On the other side, you have your son's face when he slid that phone across the counter. The way he looked, the grin. I called Roy back and asked him to keep digging. Over the following 2 weeks, Roy found 2 more names. One in Georgia, a man in his early 60s, a retired contractor who had dated a woman matching Vanessa's description for about 9 months. He'd lent her money for what she described as a medical emergency for her sister. He'd never been paid back. He hadn't filed anything because she'd disappeared before he could. And frankly, he told Roy, he was embarrassed. The second was a man in his late 50s in Tennessee. His situation was different. He hadn't lost money, or at least not much, but he had, at her request, added her name to a joint savings account early in their relationship. When they broke up, she ended it. Suddenly, with no warning, a substantial amount had moved out of that account in the week before she left. He'd filed a police report. It had gone nowhere. 3 men, 3 different states. A legal name change in between. A pattern so clean it looked like a business model. I did not sleep much that week. Here is the part that was the hardest. Daniel called me on Sunday morning, like always, and he told me he and Vanessa had set a date. Spring. He told me she'd started looking at venues. He told me he wanted me to walk her down the aisle if her own father couldn't make it. She'd told him her father was ill, out of state, uncertain, and he thought it would mean a lot to her. And to him, if I would do that. I said, tell me more about her family. He told me what she'd told him. Father in poor health in Arizona. Mother passed away years ago. No siblings. She'd had a hard life, Daniel said, with a softness in his voice that I recognized it was the same voice he'd used as a child when he brought home animals that needed help. My son had a good heart. That was the problem. I said, Daniel, I need to talk to you about something, and I made a mistake. I told him too much too soon. I told him about Roy, about the research, about the civil judgment and the 2 other men. I laid it out calmly, the way I would have presented findings to an insurance board, just the facts, sourced and documented. He was silent for almost a full minute. Then he said, you hired someone to investigate my fiancée. I said, I did, without telling me. Yes. The silence that followed was a different kind. Not processing, not considering. The silence of a decision already made. He told me I had no right. He told me Vanessa had explained her past to him, the name change, the difficult years, a relationship that had gone wrong, and a legal dispute that had been misrepresented. He told me she'd been honest with him about all of it, that she'd cried when she told him, and that he believed her. He told me I was doing exactly what I'd done his whole life, which was assume I knew better than everyone else in the room. He told me to stay out of his relationship. He hung up. I sat in the kitchen for a long time after that. The Sunday morning light came through the window above the sink the way it always does, and the house was very quiet. And I thought about his mother, who had always been better at this part than me, better at knowing when to push and when to let a thing be. I didn't call him back, but I called Roy. I told him I needed something I could put in front of Daniel that he could not rationalize away. Not a civil judgment he could attribute to misunderstanding. Not second-hand accounts from men too embarrassed to press charges. Something current, something real. Roy said, that's harder to get legitimately. I said, get as close to the line as you can and don't cross it. What Roy did next was simple, and it was legal. He created a scenario. He set up a profile, a widower, recently retired, asset-heavy, socially isolated on two of the platforms where, based on her history, women like Vanessa sometimes found their targets. The profile was not Roy. It was a carefully constructed digital person with a real-looking history and a modest but visible financial footprint. 3 weeks passed. Nothing. Then Roy called me on a Wednesday afternoon and said, "She bit." She hadn't matched with the profile directly, but the profile had a connection in common with one of her social media accounts, and she had reached out casually, the way you reach out to a friend of a friend, and they had been messaging for 10 days. The messages were friendly, warm even. She'd mentioned that she was going through a difficult time personally. She'd mentioned, very gently, a situation with her father's medical bills. She had not mentioned Daniel. Roy had screenshots of everything. I drove to Daniel's apartment on a Thursday evening without calling first. I knocked. He opened the door and his face did the thing faces do when someone appears who you are not ready to deal with, a quick sequence of reactions he didn't quite have time to hide. He let me in. I sat down at his kitchen table and I put Roy's folder in front of him. I didn't say anything. I let him open it himself. He read for a long time. I watched him. I watched him read the screenshots, her words, her warmth. Her careful mention of her father's medical bills to a man she believed was a lonely, wealthy widower. I watched him flip back to the civil judgment, which he'd dismissed before, and read it again with different eyes. He set the folder down. He said, "How long has this been going on?" I said, "The messaging? 10 days. The profile Roy built to draw her out. The prior research? About 2 months." He was very still. I had a memory, sudden and sharp, of Daniel, at about 10 years old. The moment he realized that a friend of his had been lying to him about something small, the particular expression he made, not anger first, but something more interior than that. Recalibration. He said, "She told me she'd been honest with me." I said, "I know." He said, "She cried." I said, "I know." He put his hands flat on the table and stared at them for a while. Here is what I did not do. I did not say "I told you so." I did not remind him of our phone call. I did not mention that he had hung up on me. I sat in the chair across from my son and I let him have the time he needed, because that's the only thing you can offer a person in that moment that has any value at all. After a while he said, "What do I do?" I said, "That's your decision. But Roy can refer you to a lawyer if you want to understand your options." He nodded. He called the wedding venue the next morning and canceled the deposit. He changed the passwords on his financial accounts that afternoon, all of them, including the joint account they had recently opened, which Roy had flagged and which Daniel had, until the night before, not considered a risk. He called Vanessa and ended the engagement. He told me later he kept it short. She cried. She had explanations. He told her he didn't want to hear them, and he hung up. She called back 11 times over the following 2 days. Then she stopped. Roy, as a courtesy, passed what he had on to a contact at the Philadelphia DA's office. I don't know what came of it, beyond what Daniel told me weeks later that she had been interviewed. Whether charges followed, I genuinely don't know. That wasn't why I did what I did. I did it because my son was about to hand his life to someone who had made a practice of taking what wasn't hers. And I was the only person in a position to stop it. There's a thing that happens between a parent and a child when something like this is over. It isn't a clean resolution. Daniel didn't call me the following Sunday, or the one after that. I understood. I'd gone behind his back, hired someone to investigate the woman he loved, and turned out to be right, which is in some ways harder to forgive than being wrong. Being right meant he had to accept that his judgment had failed him, that the crying and the honesty and the warmth had been, at least in part, a performance. He called me on the 3rd Sunday. Not in the morning. Late afternoon, his voice a little rough in the way it gets when he hasn't been sleeping well. He said, "I keep thinking about that first dinner. The restaurant." I said, "Yeah." He said, "I didn't see it." I said, "You weren't supposed to. That's the whole point." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, How did you know? From one dinner. I thought about how to answer that. I thought about 31 years of interviews, of claims, of sitting across tables from people who needed you to believe something that wasn't true. I thought about his mother, who would have found a gentler way through all of this. I thought about the look, the half-second calculation behind Vanessa's warm eyes when Daniel mentioned the commission number. I said, I didn't know. I just couldn't stop looking. He exhaled. It was a long exhale, the kind that carries more than air. He said, Thank you, Dad. I don't have a lot of tidy conclusions to offer. I'm not sure the lesson here is something you can bottle. I did something that my son felt was a violation. And I did it because I believed the alternative was worse. And I was right, but being right doesn't make the other part disappear. Trust, once you've gone around it, doesn't just restore itself because the outcome was good. Daniel and I are fine now. We're more than fine. But there were 3 Sunday mornings in a row when the phone didn't ring, and I sat in this kitchen with my coffee, and I felt every minute of them. What I know is this. He asked me once, much later, if I would do it again. Go behind his back. Hire Roy. Build the profile. I told him yes. Without hesitation, yes. He nodded like he'd expected that answer, and then he told me he was glad I did. That's the whole story. That's all of it. Some of you listening to this have children you'd do anything for. Some of you have been the child who didn't want to hear what a parent was trying to tell you. Most of us have been both at different times. What I know, standing on this side of it, is that love doesn't always look like letting go. Sometimes it looks like a folder on a kitchen table on a Thursday night. Sometimes it looks like staying in the chair and not saying a word while your son figures out what he already knows. His mother would have found a better way. She usually did, but she wasn't here. So I did it mine.